Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia was born in May 1857 and died in February 1905. He was the fifth son and second child of Emperor Alexander II of Russia. He was an influential figure during the reigns of his brother Emperor Alexander III of Russia and his nephew Emperor Nicholas II, who was also Sergei's brother-in-law through his marriage to Elisabeth, the sister of Empress Alix, who you can learn about on this channel. Unlike various members of the Romanov family, Grand Duke Sergei has not been canonized, but he was an impressive figure in Moscow nonetheless. He had 7 siblings: Grand Duchess Alexandra, who died of meningitis shortly before her 7th birthday, the Tsarevich Nicholas, who died of meningitis, Alexander III, who married Princess Dagmar of Denmark, which you can learn about on this channel, Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich, Grand Duke Alexei Alexandrovich, who had illegitimate issue, Grand Duchess Marie Alexandrova, who married Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich, who was very close to Sergei. Grand Duke Sergei's education gave him lifelong interests in culture and the arts. Like all male members of the Romanov dynasty, he was expected to follow a military career, and he fought in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 as well as the Japanese-Russian War of 1904. In 1882, his brother, Tsar Alexander III, appointed him commander of the 1st Battalion Preobrazhensky Life Guard Regiment, a position he held until 1891 and whose men he thought so highly of he demanded to be buried in its uniform. In 1889, Grand Duke Sergei was promoted to the rank of Major General. In 1884, he married Princess Elisabeth of Hessen by Rhine, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Their marriage was childless, but they became the guardians of the 2 children of Sergei's brother, Grand Duke Paul. Grand Duchess Maria and Grand Duke Dmitri would become Sergei's foster children. Grand Duke Dmitri was considered a romantic match for Grand Duchess Olga, daughter of the Tsar. You can learn about her life in her videos on this channel. Between 1891 and 1905, Grand Duke Sergei served as Governor-General of Moscow. His reputation was initially tarnished as he was partially blamed for the Khodynka tragedy during the festivities following the coronation of his nephew in 1896. As governor of Moscow, he pursued very conservative policies. At the start of his tenure, he expelled Moscow's 20,000 Jews and repressed a student movement to prevent the spread of socialist ideals. Because of this, he was often regarded as a reactionary, when in truth he was simply fulfilling his public duties. In 1894, Grand Duke Sergei was made a member of the State Council. In 1896, he was promoted to lieutenant general and appointed commander of the entire Moscow military district. After 13 years of service, he resigned from the governorship in January 1905, though he remained head of the Moscow military district. Targeted by the Zionist SR combat organization, he was assassinated later in 1905 by a terrorist bomb at the Kremlin during the 1905 Russian Revolution. His legacy was such that a building he owned in Palestine was seized by Israel and not returned to Russia until 2008, and he continues to be bashed in the Israeli press despite being dead for decades. His devotion to Palestine and his legacy there remains, as his wife's body was transported there from China and lies there as a saint after she was buried alive by Bolsheviks in 1918. From an early age, Sergei exhibited a passion for languages, music, and the arts, and his early studies focused strongly on these topics. However, he was destined for a career in the Russian military with his strong sense of discipline. Following his education, he took the oath of allegiance to the emperor on his 20th birthday, and then served in the Imperial Guard during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 through 1878. He continued his military service and traveled around the world representing his father. In June 1880, his mother died of tuberculosis while he was on a trip to Italy, and the following March, his father was assassinated. His elder brother, to whom he was very close, became Emperor Alexander III. In June 1881, Grand Duke Sergei, along with his younger brother Paul, traveled to Palestine and Jerusalem, where he established and served as president of the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society. This society establishes the acknowledgement of Palestine as a separate state, something that has been disputed by Israelis for decades. This organization is devoted to the preservation and upkeep of the Orthodox shrines, as well as providing services to Russian pilgrims. This is one of the projects which gave him the most pleasure and satisfaction, and one which he held very dearly for the remainder of his life. When he was appointed to the Preobrazhensky Life Guard Regiment, this was the most senior military group in the Russian forces. He eventually reached the rank of colonel and served as commander of the regiment until 1891. Until he was old enough to begin academic lessons, his earliest years were spent with his younger brother Paul, from whom he was inseparable, and their sister Maria at Lavadia, the family's Crimean retreat at Tsarskoye Selo, and at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. By the time Sergei was born in 1857, his mother was already in declining health. Although she was not a particularly affectionate mother, except to her daughter Alexandra, who died, her three youngest children, Marie, Sergei, and Paul, were very close to her and one another. Marie adored her older brother and called him an exceptionally nice young man, and can be recommended one very possible way, not because he is my brother, but because he is an exception among princes. As time passed and the Empress's health made it necessary for her to avoid harsh Russian winters, they spent long sojourns abroad in the Jugendheim outside Darmstadt, and winters in the south of France. That is where a family tragedy hit. In April 1865, shortly before Sergei's 8th birthday, his eldest brother and godfather Nicholas, the heir to the crown, died in Nice. As a child, Sergei was shy, studious, and withdrawn. Under the influence of his mother, whose reserved character he resembled, he became very religious, and the death of his brother deepened this. From the 1870s, Sergei and his brother Paul were kept in Russia by their studies. They were destined to follow military careers, but their tutor, Admiral Arseniyev, encouraged Sergei's linguistic, artistic, and musical abilities. He was fluent in several languages and learned Italian in order to read Dante in the original. His interest in Italian art and culture intensified as he grew older. He painted well and was musical, playing the flute in an amateur orchestra. He enjoyed acting and steeped himself in the early history, culture, and traditions of Russia. He liked to read, and in time came to know many of Russia's great writers personally, among them Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, whose work the Grand Duke read and admired. He met Dostoevsky over dinner at the Winter Palace, where Dostoevsky was invited by Sergei's professor. Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich started a military career early in life. He was from birth Colonel-in-Chief of the 38th Tobolsk Infantry Regiment. He became Colonel-in-Chief of the 2nd Battalion Guards Rifles, and towards the end of his life, Colonel-in-Chief of the 5th Kievsky Grenadier Regiment. He took part in the Russo-Turkish War with his father and brothers. He spent the greater part of his time serving as Poroshik officer in the Lieb Guard under the Chavchavadze in southeast Romania during that war. He was consequently promoted to colonel. In October 1877, following the Battle of Maik, the Emperor decorated him with the Order of St. George for courage and bravery in action with the enemy for a reconnaissance expedition near Koshev. At the end of December 1877, he was back in St. Petersburg with his father. Alexander II had started a new family with his mistress, Catherine, and Sergei sided with his neglected mother in the breaking of the imperial family's harmony. Empress Maria died in June 1880, and in March 1881, Alexander II, who had married his mistress, Princess Catherine Dolgoruki, was assassinated by terrorists. Sergei was then in Italy with his brother Paul and Admiral Arsyanov, his teacher. This was a time of immense religious reflection for Sergei, and he didn't know if he wanted to return to Russia. 3 months later, in June 1881, the Grand Duke went to Palestine, accompanied by Paul and his cousin, Grand Duke Constantine. They visited Jerusalem and the sacred sites. It was there that he helped to found the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society. He became its chairman, and his status as patron of the Russian presence in Jerusalem gave him a lot of happiness. He could have believed he was following in the footsteps of the Crusaders, hundreds of years before him. From 1882 on, Sergei's military career, which occupied an increasing amount of his time in St. Petersburg and on maneuvers at Krasno Selo, advanced still further. In January 1882, his brother Alexander III appointed him commander of the 1st Battalion Preobrazhensky Life Grand Regiment, the elite regiment founded by Peter the Great. 7 years later, he was promoted to the rank of Major General. In February 1891, he was made Adjutant General of the HIM Retinue. He became the commanding officer in the village of Preobrazhenskoye. He commanded this regiment until 1891, when his brother, the Emperor, appointed him Governor-General of Moscow. At 26, the fair-haired Grand Duke was reserved, intelligent, well-read, and refined. Over 6 feet tall, his extremely slim figure was accentuated by a corset, worn in the manner of Prussian officers. With his closely cropped hair and neat beard, Sergei cut an impressive figure. When Consuelo Vanderbilt, then Duchess of Marlborough, met him in Moscow, she considered him to be one of the most handsome men I have ever seen. Described by his brother-in-law, Ernest Louis, Grand Duke of Hesse, as tall and fair with delicate features and beautiful light green eyes. Very self-conscious, he held himself very stiffly, and with a hard expression in his eyes. His health was severely compromised as he suffered from osteoarticular tuberculosis, a condition he strove to conceal, but it caused all of his joints to waste away. One of his nephews would die from the disease, and its risk was very real. It led to great discomfort as his bones ground against each other, and he had a very stiff walk. He had to take salts and hot baths for relief. He could not ride a horse, and had to wear a spinal corset at all times. He stood very straight and had a habit of playing with one of his jeweled golden rings, turning it around on his finger. One of his pocket watches survived and was auctioned off recently, as was his bookplate revealing his love of reading. He kept his feelings rigidly in check, and many mistook his reserve for pride. Few got the chance to know him well as he was so busy. He was noted for his adherence to the church, took a deep interest in Russian antiques and art treasures, and was interested in archaeology, music, and acting, and sometimes chaired meetings of the Archaeological Congress. A series of Russian archaeological congresses began in 1867. The aim of these conferences was to discuss and to make public studies dealing with matters of antiquity and ethnography. The conferences were held in a different city every 3 years. While shy and reserved, he made no secret of his disapproval of fashionable society and its lax ways, probably stemming from the social acceptance of his father's mistress Catherine, and he defied all criticism. He found it hard to cope with opposition, and easily lost his temper. In his home he demanded tidiness, order, and discipline, and expected to be obeyed as a Grand Duke. The interiors of his palaces, with pink and gold, reveal his love of order. His niece, Marie, Queen of the Romanians, remembered him dry, nervous, short of speech, impatient. He had none of the rather careless good humor of his 3 elder brothers, but for all that we loved him, felt irresistibly attracted to him hard though he could be, few perhaps cherish his memory, but I do. Many other family members, including his nephew Kirill, Princess Mary of Greece, and Prince Gabriel, included very good impressions of him in their memoirs. We see a glimpse of him in a remembrance by Coco Chanel, who had an affair with his adopted son, Grand Duke Dmitri, in the French Riviera. These Grand Dukes, they are all the same, an admirable face behind which there is nothing, green eyes, broad shoulders, fine hands, the most peaceful people, shyness itself, they drink just not to be afraid, tall, handsome, superb, these Russians are, and behind that is nothing, hollowness and vodka. But behind Sergei there wasn't hollowness. He had watched his siblings die. He watched his father pursue another woman right before his beloved mother's death. He was deeply religious and took his military career very seriously. In 1881, there had been talks of a possible marriage to Princess Caroline Mathilde of Schleswig-Holstein. Emperor Alexander II had hoped at least one of his sons would marry a princess of Hesse as he had done. Sergei obliged and eventually chose as his bride Princess Elisabeth of Hesse, a daughter of Ludwig IV, Grand Duke of Hesse and Bye-Rhine, and Princess Alice of the United Kingdom. She, who would be known as Ella, was an older sister of both Ernst Ludwig, Grand Duke of Hesse and Bye-Rhine, and Alix of Hesse, later the Empress, of Nicholas II of Russia, and a niece of Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, who married his older sister, Grand Duchess Maria. They were first cousins once removed, since Elizabeth's great-grandfather, her father's paternal grandfather, Louis II, was Sergei's maternal grandfather, and had known each other all their lives. There were hesitations on both sides, and Elizabeth first rejected his proposal of marriage. Queen Victoria, who had anti-Russian sentiments, opposed the marriage of her motherless granddaughter. Elizabeth and her sisters were not pressured into following political marriages. They were allowed to follow their own inclination. After the couple spent some time together at Schloss Wolfsgarten in Darmstadt in September 1883, Elizabeth agreed to marry Sergei. Their engagement was announced publicly in February 1884, when Sergei returned to visit her in Darmstadt. Upon her marriage, Princess Elisabeth took the name of Grand Duchess Elisabeth Fyodorovna of Russia. The wedding took place in June 1884 in the Winter Palace, and the wedding was where the future Tsar Nicholas II and his bride, Empress Alix, would meet. You can learn about Empress Alix's jewelry collection on this channel. Sergei and Ella spent their honeymoon in Elinskoye, Sergei's 2,400-acre country estate 40 miles west of Moscow on the left bank of the Moskva River, which he inherited from his mother, the Empress. The couple later settled in St. Petersburg in a mansion occupying the southeast corner of the Fontanka Canal and the Nevsky Prospect, a short drive from Sergei's former apartments in the Winter Palace. The Boleski-Belozorsky mansion, bought by Sergei to live with his wife, was renamed Sergeyevsky Palace. The couple also had Firma, a villa located in the grounds of Peterhof that Sergei had inherited from his mother. They usually entertained at Elinsko during the summer months, with guests occupying various wooden villas dotted around its park. There was also Usovo, a substantial stone and brick home with an innovative central heating system that Sergei had designed and built on the opposite bank of the Moskva River near Elinskoye. The couple was close to Sergei's brother Alexander III and his wife Maria, and the Tsar trusted Sergei more than his other brothers. In 1886, Alexander III appointed Sergei commander of the Life Guard Regiment, entrusting him with introducing the Tsarevich, the future Nicholas II, to military life. Sergei and Ella represented Russia in 1887 during Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, and in 1888 they were sent to the Holy Land on the occasion of the consecration of the Church of Mary Magdalene in Jerusalem, built in memory of Sergei's mother, Empress Maria Alexandrova. By 1892, 8 years into the marriage, Sergei was certain that they would not have children, and he left a will making the children of his brother Paul, Maria, and Dmitri his heirs after his and his wife's deaths. Grand Duke Dmitri was considered a potential match for Grand Duchess Olga Nikolaevna, daughter of Tsar Nicholas II. Dmitri was known to take long walks with Tsar Nicholas II and was a beloved member of the close-knit royal family in his youth. In August 1915, when Nicholas II left St. Petersburg to take full command of the Russian armies during World War I, Empress Alix took on the daily administrative affairs of the government from the capital. She relied on Grigory Rasputin, a peasant healer who appeared to have brought her hemophiliac son, Alexei, back from the brink of death. Perhaps Rasputin was skilled at meditation or hypnotism, as he was able to calm the young Alexei as other doctors had not done. As Russian defeats mounted during World War I, both Rasputin and Alix became increasingly unpopular. Eventually, Sergei's adopted son, Grand Duke Dmitri, joined Felix Yusupov, Vladimir Purishkevich, the leader of the monarchists in the newly created Duma, Dr. Stanislaus de Lazavert, and Lieutenant Sergei Sikotin, an officer in Sergei's own regiment, in a conspiracy to kill Rasputin, hoping that ending his influence over the imperial family would have a beneficial effect on the Tsar's policies and Russia. Prince Felix Yusupov, whose memoir remains in print, was a drinking, gambling lad about town, and this change in Grand Duke Dmitri's friendship circle affected Grand Duchess Olga and her mother. There is some scholarship to indicate Grand Duke Dmitri only befriended Yusupov to get closer to Princess Irina, who he was secretly in love with, but Yusupov would marry her. At any rate, Grand Duchess Olga and her mother became disgusted with her cousin's choices, and he was dropped from the marriage shortlist. He was exiled to Persia, now Iran, by Olga's father, the Tsar, due to his participation in the murder of Rasputin, despite a petition circulating around the palaces demanding he remain in Russia, signed by many Romanov family members. When this petition reached the Tsar rejected it after just a few days, wondering in writing why he was appealed to at all. One wonders how it may have happened if Olga had stood up for him or if Dmitri had been permitted to remain in Russia. Perhaps he would have been able to convince the imperial family that Rasputin and his entire network was a toxic influence and righted certain wrongs. Sergei was an intensely religious man. Despite this, scholars today insist he was gay. Count Witt, who replaced the Tsar as head of the Russian government and was extremely biased, wrote that Sergei was always surrounded by comparatively young men who were excessively affectionate towards him. It must be noted, so was Prince Yusupov, who actually dressed up as a woman on multiple occasions, and yet he still had a happy marriage. In her memoirs, Countess Lily de Nostitz said, "It was well known that the Grand Duke Sergei was one of those unhappy men cursed with the failing of loving only their own sex." The diary of prominent St. Petersburg hostess Alexandra Bogdanovich refers to Sergei's alleged affairs with his aide-de-camps Martynov and Belasny, while after Sergei was appointed governor of Moscow, Count Vladimir Lambsdorff punned, "Moscow used to stand on 7 hills, and now it has to stand on one tiny hill." The Russian word for tiny hill sounds similar to the French word for bugger or gay. Some reports suggest Sergei's sexuality might have conflicted with his intense religious beliefs and the expectations of his position. But Sergei shared a bed with his wife Ella his entire life, which was rare for royals at the time. He treated her very tenderly, as we can see in a letter that he wrote to her either during or after their engagement. "Time is going great. Ella, if possible, is even more beautiful, he wrote. We sit together a lot. In the morning she is in my room, and I teach her a little Russian, which is very funny. I even make her write. By the way, I teach her the words, God save the Tsar, on the old Christmas tree, etc. We are already walking alone all over Darmstadt, and yesterday we paid a visit to old Trotta together. It always touches me to visit her because these are the same rooms where dear mother lived as a child, and even on one window on the glass mother wrote her name in 1835. There was a little ball here the other day, very nice, and Ella and I danced hard. But of course there is zero animation, and then they dance a waltz in 3 measures, which is terrible. There was a big engagement dinner at the Cassell, and Ella appeared in the Catherine ribbon for the first time, named for Catherine the Great. Having children would have been very difficult for Sergei and Ella due to his tuberculosis, which can result in infertility, nothing to do with homosexuality. It seems unlikely he was gay. Emperor Alexander III adopted a policy of repression in the face of spiraling Bolshevism and anarchy, and he wanted a like mind at the helm of Imperial Russia's second city and former capital. Thus, in spring 1891, the Tsar appointed Sergei as Governor General of Moscow. Although it was a great honor, Grand Duke Sergei accepted his new appointment with reluctance. He had hoped to stay longer in command of the elite regiment, where he was popular, and he and his wife loved the quiet life they were living in St. Petersburg. The vice-regal role of Governor-General ruling Prince of Moscow was one that was answerable only to the emperor. Grand Duke Sergei was a political hardliner who shared his brother's inalienable belief in strong, nationalistic government. His tenure began with the expulsion of Moscow's 20,000 Jews. This started 4 weeks before he arrived at the city in person, after the publication of an imperial ukase by the Minister of the Interior Ivan Durnovo, by which all Jews of lower social stance, including artisans and minor traders, had to be expelled from Moscow. Sergei knew the Jewish calendar and decided to act on days that the Jews were congregated. On the 29th of March, the first day of Passover, the city's Jewish population learned of the new decree that called for their expulsion. This was not the first Jewish expulsion from Russia, simply one of many pogroms that swept across the empire. In 3 carefully planned phases over the next 12 months, Moscow's Jews were expelled in 1891. Those first to go were the unmarried, the childless, and those who had lived in the city for less than 3 years, due to concerns about anarchist activity from new arrivals, and the membership of these individuals in groups like the Socialist Revolutionary Party and the People's Will. Next, it was the turn of apprentices, of families with up to 4 children, and those with less than 6 years' residency in the city to be banned. By structuring the removal over residency, Sergei ensured that families who had been in the city a long time were exempt. Last of all, it was the turn of the old Jewish settlers with large families and numerous employees, some of whom had lived in Moscow for 40 years, but most of whom had lived there not very long at all. Young Jewish women were made to register as prostitutes if they wanted to stay in the city, but men were made to leave. During the expulsion, homes were surrounded by mounted Cossacks in the middle of the night while policemen ransacked their houses. In January 1892, in a temperature of 30 degrees below zero, Brest Station was packed with Jews of all ages and sexes, surrounded by meager remnants of household goods, all leaving voluntarily rather than face deportation. Sergei, as Governor General, was petitioned by the police commissioners to stop the expulsions until the weather conditions improved. He agreed on the surface, but the order was not published until the expulsions were over. The vast majority of Jews left Moscow voluntarily, and there wasn't a lot of violence. With the expulsion, the silk industry vanished from Moscow. It had relied on young girls for labor, and was replaced by Russian weavers and domestically produced wool, leather, and fur clothing. The Volga tannery, for example, which has existed since the 1700s, received a much-needed boost and remains in production to this day. To meet the needs of Russian students, Sergei ordered the start of the construction of new dormitories in the city. At the same time, however, severe restrictions were imposed on the students and professors in the universities as part of the state's policy of conspiracy prevention and elimination of revolutionary ideas. Sergei correctly identified the universities as the hotbed of anarchist activity. It wasn't the peasant class that was the most revolutionary at the time. In contrast, they enjoyed seeing the Tsar. It was upper and middle class Jews like Mikhail Gotz who could afford to go to university in the first place that were agitating a lot. This made Sergei very unpopular in Moscow among the intelligentsia, although the more conservative citizens were very pleased with him. The Muscovite nobility and merchants despised him because they said he was rough and lacked tact while attempting to fight commercial fraud and enforce strict policy measures. However, he significantly improved general living conditions during his tenure and was extremely conscientious in carrying out his duties. Even in the country when he was supposed to be resting, his niece noted, he was constantly receiving couriers from Moscow and giving audiences to everyone. He paid attention to detail, attending personally to matters that could have easily been left to subordinates, and punished corruption and fraud himself. At times, he went about the city incognito to see conditions for himself, in a very early rendition of Undercover Boss. In private, he and his wife were concerned about the poverty they saw in Moscow and the surrounding countryside, discussing ways to improve it. They decided to harness the massive Russian Romanov government to make a change. Welfare organizations and charities always attracted Sergei's attention, and he became either chairman or patron of scores of these, reflecting his ability to control vast groups at once. He was chairman of the Moscow Society for the Care, Upbringing, and Education of Blind Children, chair of the Society for Homeless Neglected Children and Convicted Adolescents, and chair of the Moscow Department of the Russian Department Society of National Health Protection. He was also the patron of Moscow and St. Petersburg universities, the Printers' Mutual Aid Fund, the Society of Care for Aged Actors, the Tsukov Non-Classical Secondary School, and Prince Nicholas Almhouses. He was chairman of the academies of both arts and sciences, the Moscow Archaeological Society, the Society of Agriculture, the Russian Musical Society, the Historical Museum in Moscow, and the Moscow Theological Academy, among many others. Tsar Alexander III died on the 1st of November 1894, and his son Nicholas II ascended to the Russian throne. The relationship between Grand Duke Sergei and his nephew, who had served under his command in the Preobrazhensky Life Guard Regiment, was close, and it became closer with Nicholas II's marriage to Princess Alix of Hesse, the youngest sister of Sergei's wife, a union that Sergei and his wife helped promote. The coronation ceremonies of the new emperor and his wife, as tradition demanded, took place in Moscow. Sergei, as governor-general of that city, was in charge of overseeing the arrangements. As part of the preparations, Sergei introduced the novelty of electricity to Moscow in 1894. The electrification of Moscow was ignored by English-speaking scholars until 1992, so intent was the desire to depict Russia as backwards. According to publications by Cornell University, electrification grew slowly in Russia, especially compared with the West. Over a decade passed between the first Russian commercial utility in 1886 and the first large wave of utilities elsewhere in the country. Another decade passed before utilities truly surged into Russian towns and cities. The Russian environment contributed to this slow diffusion, but so did uncertainties about technologies, funding, and organization. Russian decision-makers had to respond to the major issues in the electrification of the West, the choice between electricity and other forms of energy, questions about which technology to generate electricity, and debates about the organization and ownership of the utility. Since Sergei's introduction of electricity to Moscow, the Soviets didn't develop a map for grid expansion until 1920. Towards the end of the coronation festivities, according to custom, every newly crowned Tsar presented gifts to the entire population. Khodynka Field, on the outskirts of Moscow, was where the distribution was held since the coronation of Tsar Alexander II. The choice was questionable, as the field was normally used as a military training ground and was crisscrossed by ditches and muddy. Nevertheless, Sergei, as governor general, approved the plans. It was tradition. Although a crowd of nearly 500,000 was expected from all over Russia, only one squadron of Cossacks and a small detachment of police were sent to maintain order. Early in the morning on May 30th, 1896, families began to gather outside the frail wooden fence that protected the field, watching carts laden with beer, and eagerly sought after gifts. Around 6 a.m., a rumor swept through the massive crowd that the booths had already opened and the souvenirs were being given out. Who spread this rumor? Suddenly moving as one, the great body of people began to surge forward in the direction of the booths. As it did so, men, women, and children, hundreds of whom had no idea what was happening, fell or slipped on the uneven ground and were crushed and trampled underfoot. Others suffocated. The police, far too few in numbers to direct the crowd, were helpless, and even the Cossacks, when they arrived, were unable to stop the catastrophe. 1,300 people, many hideously mutilated and unrecognizable, were killed, and twice that number were seriously injured. While Grand Duke Sergei had not directly participated in the planning for Khodynka Field, he was blamed for the lack of foresight, and as Governor General held as ultimately responsible. But he said Illyrian Count Vorontsov-Dashkov, head of the Ministry of the Imperial Court, with whom there had been some dispute over the management of the coronation festivities beforehand, was to blame, and Colonel Alexander Vlasovsky, the city of Moscow's chief of police. Count Vorontsov-Dashkov was very much a military man, and he was in his late 50s by the time of the tragedy. He was on friendly terms with the future Alexander III, and following Alexander's father's assassination, established a counter-revolutionary squad, or druzhina, called the Holy Brotherhood. He had little experience in infrastructure and managing parades. The chief of police was the one who refused to supply additional units, requiring the interference of the royal Cossacks to bring order. But in the eyes of public opinion, Sergei had done himself great harm by not going to the scene of the incident, or at least appearing at the victims' funerals. But he did report that he was deeply sad about the disaster. After the tragedy, there was a split in the Romanov family. Many members of the Romanov family, headed by Grand Duke Nicholas Mikhailovich and his brothers, thought that the remaining festivities should be cancelled. But Sergei and his brothers thought that a historical event such as a coronation should not be disrupted or marred by a period of mourning. The latter opinion was the crowds who came long distances should not be disappointed, and that the tightly scheduled events for foreign dignitaries should not be slighted. There was also division among the Romanov family as to whether Grand Duke Sergei should have resigned there and then. Grand Duke Nicholas Mikhailovich and his brothers called for his resignation, while Sergei's own brothers closed ranks, supporting him, and threatened to retire from public life if Sergei was made the scapegoat for the Khodynka tragedy. Ultimately, Sergei took responsibility and offered to resign, while Vorontsov-Dashkov did not. In the end, the new Tsar did not support a thoroughly proposed investigation. The chief of police was dismissed, and Grand Duke Sergei retained his office. The night of the tragedy, Tsar Nicholas II attended a ball in honor of the French, probably the most blatant public show of disregard for the event, but he insisted he had to show his face at this diplomatic event. Because of that, his reputation also suffered for what was perceived to be his lack of sympathy for the victims. In 1894, Sergei was made a member of the State Council. In 1896, he was promoted to lieutenant general and appointed as commander of Moscow Military District. Because he was devoted to the policies of his nephew, the Tsar regarded him as a useful counterweight to some of his ministers and officials, and would always readily take his side. When in 1896 disturbances broke out in the universities, Nicholas II was grateful for his uncle's prompt action and that of the authorities that quickly restored order. Although Sergei was often condemned as a complete reactionary during his governorship, according to his brother-in-law Ernest, Grand Duke of Hesse, he wanted and strove for improvements, which angered many, and he also blocked revolutionary reforms because he considered them impractical, thus infuriating radicals. And so he tried to maintain the middle ground, always. Sergei's enigmatic personality and harsh manners made him appear arrogant and disagreeable, but he loved Russian literature and met both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, liking them both. Shy by nature, with chronic tuberculosis, he dreaded personal contact. When courtesy demanded a handshake, he solved the problem by wearing one white glove. Puritan and humorless, at least in public, he had a total disregard for public opinion he likely learned during his father's affair. He never seemed to be at ease with himself among others. He became a focus for serious opponents of the regime as well as for malicious gossip and press. But critics could not have missed that he was the perfect foil to his nephew, Nicholas II, for getting things done. Where Nicholas was sensitive, Sergei was firm. Where there was mysticism in the Russian court, Sergei was deeply religious. Together they could have created great policy for Russia for decades, but the Russian court dragged both down. Sergei's cousin, Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, left a damaging description about him. Try as I will, he wrote, I cannot find a single redeeming feature in his character. Obstinate, arrogant, disagreeable, he flaunted his many peculiarities in the face of the entire nation. Later writers have accused him of sadism. Grand Duke Alexander said, Uncle Sergei, Grand Duke Sergei, played a fatal part in the downfall of the empire, having been partially responsible for the Khodynka catastrophe during the coronation of the year 1896. A very poor officer, he commanded the Preobrazhensky Regiment, the crack regiment of the Imperial Guard. A complete ignoramus in administrative affairs, he held fast to the general governorship of the Moscow area, which should have been entrusted to a statesman of exceptionally seasoned experience. Obstinate, arrogant, disagreeable, he flaunted his many peculiarities in the face of the entire nation, providing the enemies of the regime with inexhaustible material for calumnies and libels. The generals visiting the mess room of the Preobrazhensky Regiment listened with stupefaction to the chorus of officers singing a favorite song of Grand Duke Sergei, with its refrain consisting of the words "and peace and love and bliss." The august commander himself illustrated those not very soldier-like words by throwing his body back and registering a tortured rapture in his features. In this, it seems, Grand Duke Alexander was totally unaware of the illnesses of Grand Duke Sergei. Grand Duke Alexander went on to write, the Tsar should never have allowed Uncle Sergei to retain his post in Moscow after the storm of indignation caused by the Khodynka catastrophe. As though to accentuate the repugnant personality on a background of virtue, he married Grand Duchess Elisabeth, the elder sister of the Tsarina. No two human beings could have offered such a young contrast. Ravishing beauty, rare intelligence, a delightful sense of humor, infinite patience, hospitality of thought, generous heart, all gifts were hers. It was cruel and unjust that a woman of her nature should marry such a man. A great deal of controversy around Grand Duke Sergei has centered on the nature of his personal life. Conjecture about the perhaps unhappy nature of the relationship with his wife has abounded. His marriage is barely documented. His private papers, including his correspondence with his wife, have not survived due to the assassination of both he and his wife by Zionist anarchists, and the evidence that does exist in the Moscow State Archives, the most important repository of Romanov papers, is open to interpretation. Contrary to the belief that the marriage was unhappy, the marriage was happy in its own way. unusually for royal couples, they slept in the same bed for all of their married life. Forced to defend Sergei against rumors of discord at court, Elizabeth was devoted to her husband and treasured his memory after his death. She wore the blue dress she had on during his murder for days afterwards, and could not sleep alone. Sergei's niece and foster daughter, Maria, wrote about them. She and my uncle seemed never very intimate. They met for the most part only at meals, and by day avoided being alone together. They slept, however, up to the last year of their life together in the same great bed. Although their marriage remained childless, the two children of Sergei's brother Paul often joined their household. Grand Duchess Maria and Grand Duke Dmitri joined their household, spending Christmases and later some summer holidays with Sergei and his wife. The couple set aside a playroom and bedrooms for these youngsters. In 1902, Grand Duke Paul was banished from living in Russia after he contracted a morganatic marriage, and Sergei asked for and obtained the guardianship of his niece and nephew. As a foster father, Sergei was strict and demanding, but devoted and affectionate towards the children. Nevertheless, Maria and Dmitri resented their aunt and uncle, blaming them for the forced separation from their real father, who had abandoned them. While Sergei had their best interests at heart, his preoccupation with the smallest detail of their education and upbringing were not appealing to the two difficult adolescents, especially the obstinate Maria, but she seemed to appreciate it by the time she wrote her autobiography. By the end of 1904, Russia had suffered disastrously in the Russo-Japanese War, and the country was in turmoil. As discontent and demonstration multiplied, so did the pressure on Sergei to maintain order. He was of the opinion that only the utmost severity could put an end to the revolutionary ferment. But in the wake of civil disorder, Nicholas II made concessions. He did not support the Tsar's security policies of vacillations and evasions, as well as the giving up of power in the Duma. He preferred to fight outright. According to his foster daughter, Marie Pavlovna, it appeared my uncle little less than monstrous. He expressed deep sorrow for the state of affairs in Russia, for the necessity of serious measures, and of the criminal weakness of the Tsar's ministers and counselors. Thoroughly disillusioned with the whole situation of the Russian government, and deciding it was the right time to retire into private life, he informed the Tsar that new times needed new faces. After 13 years of service, he resigned from the governorship in January 1905 and was succeeded by Dmitry Fyodorovich Trepov, whose own nieces tried to assassinate him. Sergei continued as commander of the Moscow military district, however. Following his resignation, he moved to the Neskochnaya Palace with his wife and foster children. Shortly thereafter, they moved to the Nicholas Palace within the safety of the Kremlin under the cover of night. Violence in Moscow was exploding. Sergei took every precaution advised by his detectives. He and his wife rarely ventured outside. At home, they only received their closest friends. Like his father, Alexander II, Sergei was firm in the belief that unless it was the will of God, no attempt on his life would succeed. If it were the will of God, no amount of security would prevent it. One precaution he did take was for the benefit of his adjutants, whom he would no longer allow to travel with him, sending them back to their families. On February 15, 1905, the family attended a concert at the Bolshoi Theater in aid of his wife's Red Cross War Charities. A terrorist organization learned his route. The Socialist Revolutionary Party's combat detachment planned to assassinate him that day. However, one of their members, Ivan Kalyayev, noticed the children in the carriage and decided to call off their attack. To kill the Grand Duchess and the children would surely have sparked a wave of apprehension throughout the empire, and would have set the revolutionary cause back by years. The Bolsheviks wanted to be sure. Having had lunch with his wife at Nicholas Palace on February 17th, Grand Duke Sergei left unaccompanied for the Governor-General's mansion. Because of the looming threat, Sergei refused to take his adjutant Alexei, since he was married and a father. The arrival of the Grand Duke's recognizable carriage, drawn by a pair of horses and driven by his coachman Andrei Rudenkin, alerted the terrorist who had been waiting in the Kremlin with a bomb wrapped in newspapers. Just before 2:45, the carriage of the Grand Duke passed through the gate of Nikolaevska Tower of the Kremlin and turned the corner of the Chudov Monastery into the square. From a distance no more than 4 feet away and still some 60 feet inside the Nikolaevsky gate, Ivan Kalyayev stepped forward and threw a nitroglycerin bomb directly into Sergei's lap. The explosion disintegrated the carriage and the Grand Duke died immediately. Scattered all over the blood-stained snow lay pieces of scorched cloth, fur, and leather. The body of the Grand Duke was mutilated, with the head, the upper part of the chest, and the left shoulder and arm blown off and completely destroyed. Some of the Grand Duke's fingers, still adorned with the rings he wore, were found on the roof of a nearby building. In this we see a potential inspiration for the death of Peter Pettigrew in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, where Pettigrew's death happens in much the same way. On impact, the carriage horses had bolted towards the Nikolaevsky gate, dragging with them the front wheels and coach box, as well as the semi-conscious and badly burned driver Rudenkin, whose back had been riddled with bits of bomb and stones. He was rushed to the nearest hospital, where he died 3 days later. Kalyayev, who by his own testimony had expected to die in the explosion, survived. Sucked into the vortex of the explosion, he ended up by the remains of the rear wheels. His face was peppered by splinters pouring with blood. Kalyayev was immediately arrested, sentenced to death, and hanged 2 months later. The Grand Duchess Ella rushed to the scene of the explosion. Stunned but perfectly in control, she gave instructions and, kneeling in the snow, helped gather her husband's remains. The remains were placed on a stretcher and covered with an army greatcoat. According to Edvard Radzinski, during the trial of Kalyayev, Grand Duchess Ella spent all the days before the burial in ceaseless prayer. On her husband's tombstone she wrote, "Father, release them, they know not what they do." She understood the words of the Gospels, heart and soul, and on the eve of the funeral she demanded to be taken to the prison where Kalyayev was being held. Brought into his cell, she asked, "Why did you kill my husband?" He said, "I killed Sergei Alexandrovich because he was a weapon of tyranny. I was taking revenge for the people." "Do not listen to your pride. Repent," she said. "I will beg the sovereign to give you your life. I will ask him for you. I myself have already forgiven you." On the eve of revolution, she had already found a way out: forgiveness. Forgive through the impossible pain and blood, and thereby stop it then, at the beginning, this bloody wheel. By her example, poor Ella appeared to society, calling upon the people to live in Christian faith. "No," replied Kalyayev, whose movement would decry the Bible as anti-revolutionary years later. "I do not repent. I must die for my deed, and I will. My death will be more useful to my cause than Sergei's death." Kalyayev was sentenced to death. "I am pleased with your sentence," he told the judges. "I hope that you will carry it out just as openly and publicly as I carried out the sentence of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. Learn to look the advancing revolution right in the face." French media giant Pathé recreated the entire scene for its viewers and broadcast the event throughout Europe. In the Pathé production, the revolutionaries are depicted as professional, sane, sitting at a table and plotting their next move. In 1905, Pathé was rolling out its disc records, and the reenactment may have been a commercial strategy. Deeply affected by the Grand Duke's death, Grand Duchess Elisabeth retired from the royal family and founded the Russian Orthodox convent of Martha and Mary, where she dedicated herself to the care of Moscow's poor and suffering, just as her husband had done. Part of the obligations of the sisters of the Martha and Mary convent was to make an annual pilgrimage to the sepulchral church in memory of the Grand Duke on the day of his repose, February 4th. Elisabeth was murdered during the Russian Civil War in 1918, together with many other Romanov relatives. Her body and that of a fellow nun was smuggled to China and eventually reached Jerusalem. The two wooden coffins were met at the railway station by the deputy British governor, Sir Harry Charles Luke, and taken for burial at the Church of Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives that Grand Duchess Elizabeth had toured so many years before with her husband. Unfortunately, this area and much of Palestine has been bombed indiscriminately by Israel for the past decade, including the 900-year-old St. Porphyrius Church built by the Crusaders Grand Duke Sergei admired so much, which was bombed by Israel last October, killing dozens of Christians. Grand Duke Sergei's body was first buried in a crypt of the Chudov Monastery within the precincts of the Moscow Kremlin. A memorial cross, created from public donations, was placed on the spot where he was killed in 1908. After the downfall of the Romanovs, the cross was destroyed with the personal participation of Jew Vladimir Lenin. Chudov Monastery was demolished in 1928, and the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet was built on the site, which featured huge murals of Lenin inside. The burial crypt of the Grand Duke was located in a courtyard of that building, which had been used as a parking lot. The Bolsheviks loved driving over the body of Grand Duke Sergei every day on the way to work. Remember that the next time someone tells you to show restraint to your political enemies. In 1990, building workers in the Kremlin discovered the blocked entrance of the burial vault. The coffin was discovered and examined and found to contain the Grand Duke's remains, covered with the military greatcoat of the Kiev regiment, decorations, and an icon. He had left written instructions that he was to be buried in the Preobrazhensky Lifeguard Regiment uniform, but as his body was so badly mutilated, this was impossible. In 1995, the coffin was officially exhumed, and after a panakida in the Kremlin Cathedral of the Archangel, it was reburied in a vault of the Novopasevsky Monastery in Moscow in September 1995. In May 2017, Grand Duke Sergei's memorial cross was restored in a ceremony that was attended by President Vladimir Putin and the Patriarch of Moscow. Russia will not forget Grand Duke Sergei.